Hey everyone, welcome to Reflections, the wisdom of Edgar Cayce. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. We are coming to you as always courtesy of our broadcasting partner at The More Show. This week on the show, joining me is one of my favorite guests, Lynn Sparrow Christy. Lynn is the author of the book Beyond Soul Growth, Awakening to the Call of Cosmic Evolution. She is a teacher, writer, and hypnotherapist life coach with more than 40 years of experience with both traditional and alternative approaches to spirituality. Her earlier books, Edgar Cayce and Christian Faith, and Reincarnation, Claiming Your Past, Creating Your Future, as well as her home study courses, Meditation Made Easy, and How to Discover Your Past Lives, have all explored Cayce's contribution to leading topics in contemporary spirituality. Over the past several decades, Lynn has conducted numerous seminars in cities throughout North America and several international locations. Lynn also works as a certified master hypnotherapist and a hypnosis trainer. She is also a neuro-linguistic programming practitioner and a life coach. She maintains a private practice in Virginia Beach. In addition to her work with the Journey to Wholeness and Integrative Growth program, which you can find out more at journey2wing.org, she is also mentoring ARE's online learning program, which is titled Reincarnation, Karma, and Destiny, Working with Universal Law to Change Your Life. And this online mentoring program that she's taking on is taking place from September 7th through October 4th of 2016. That's this year. If you can register at edgarcayce.org/egroups. And Lynn is also a feature presenter at the annual ARE New Year's Conference. And this year it's centered around the law of attraction and takes place from December 29th through the 31st of 2016. And that, of course, will be at the ARE in Virginia Beach. If you'd like to register, you can visit edgarcayce.org/conferences. Lynn, thank you so much for joining us today on Reflections, the wisdom of Edgar Cayce.
Well, I always enjoy talking with you, Brent.
Excellent. Now, Lynn, last time you were on the show, your book Beyond Soul Growth was just coming out, so we got to really dive into the topics that you had covered in that book. I want to talk a little more this time about your ARE mentoring program. You're doing an online course titled Reincarnation, Karma, and Destiny. It's working with universal laws to change your life. And Lynn, for our viewers who may be unfamiliar, what can you tell us about what makes an ARE online course unique? And also, how is it different from a more traditional home study course?
Well, of course, one of the unique aspects of an ARE online course is that it's firmly grounded in the information in the Cayce material. There's always a strong tie-in there. But one of the things I love about these online mentored courses is that there is so much opportunity for interaction. We can make surprisingly close connections with people in an online community. And what happens with these courses is that those who are participating come to really care about one another as they interact. And I have interaction with all of the participants, at least those who care to go online. That's always optional, of course. You can just download the material and go through it. But for those who want the interaction with the other group members, who want to share their experience with me or ask me questions about their progress through the material, it's a very personal thing. Some of my online participants have remained friends years later. And it's a great opportunity for stretching that consciousness connection over cyberspace.
Wonderful. I'll look forward to that.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was going to say it's also paced, and I think that's another thing that's different. When you get a home study course, it can be a little bit overwhelming. These online mentored courses are released in 4 weeks worth of material, and it's deliberately paced so that people can make their way through in a way that is comfortable for their lifestyle.
Wonderful. Love that.
Yeah.
And then your online course, as I mentioned, is centered around karma and destiny.
Yes.
And it seems from studying your work over the years, it seems karma and destiny are very intimately connected as you bring it through in your work. So how would you explain to our viewers the difference between the two and what exactly makes them so interconnected as they play out in our lives?
Well, I like that you said interconnected because karma and destiny in many people's minds are synonymous. it's my karma means it has to happen. There's nothing I can do about it. Or karma gets tied with fate, which is another word we sometimes link with destiny. But the way the Cayce material works with karma, and really, if you look more deeply at a lot of the Eastern approaches to karma, it's the same thing. Our destiny is nothing more or less than what we have set up for ourselves based on a snapshot in time. One of my past teachers used to say, yes, your future is predetermined, and you're predetermining it moment by moment. And that's a pretty interesting concept, because destiny is not fixed in the sense that the destiny that I might have this moment, the destiny that you might have in this moment, is unchangeable. It just means that if we could somehow freeze this fluid thing we call time, there would be an absolute destiny based on the whole collection of factors that are true at play right now. But if I were to make a change in my consciousness, in my intention, in my actions, in the next moment, my destiny would shift along with that. So that's why I think it's good to look at karma and destiny as related, but destiny being something, and therefore karma being something, that tends to flow in response to what's in our consciousness. And that's a big difference between thinking that it's fixed, unchangeable, we're stuck with it no matter what.
Yeah, definitely. And Lynn, it seems from my understanding of karma that it seems to be an immutable force in our lives, something that's inevitable and something we can't avoid. As you've mentioned, we are creating our own karma every moment of every day with our choices, but also with our thoughts. As Cayce said, thoughts are very much things, just as real as
Right.
anything in this world. Have you found this to be true in your work?
Yes, I have. And I think the thing to keep in mind about that immutability and karma, certainly if any of what we are looking at concerning universal law is valid, karma can't be turned on and off. It's not something that's operating sometimes, not operating other times. It's a law, the same way we might say that gravity is a law. So, for example, if I were to climb up to my roof and walk off the ledge, the action of the law of gravity would be pretty predictable. However, if I understood the laws of aerodynamics and I could build some kind of a glider, some kind of a parachute or whatever, gravity would still do what it does to draw me down to the earth, but my experience of how that manifested in my life would be different based on how I worked with the laws of aerodynamics. So, yes, karma is immutable in that there's no turning it on and turning it off. But the pathway that our karma takes, the manifestation that our karma might bring into our experience is very mutable, because it's always an interaction between the law and what we are holding in consciousness.
Right. Very well put. Thank you, Lynn. And you mentioned a couple things in that latest comment about natural and universal laws. And something I've always found interesting is the idea that we teach these Newtonian laws to our children in school as they grow up. And one of the laws is for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And I find it so interesting that we teach that as a scientific law, but yet we seem to miss the spiritual application of that in our everyday lives, which seems to be karma. Would you agree with
Yes,
that?
I would totally agree with that. And I think that not only is it important for children and older people to understand that action reaction, the complexity of it is that there are always so many factors at play that we have to be aware of very simplistic understandings of how that works. So, for example, you might find somebody working very hard with the law of attraction and frustrated that things are not turning out the way the books promise they should. And yet, it doesn't mean that cause effect, action reaction law isn't in place. It just means that we don't have all of the factors at our disposal in our awareness. It could be a matter of time. Maybe those things that someone is trying very hard to manifest are going to happen at a later time when all conditions can converge in a way to make that manifestation possible. Maybe there is something at the unconscious level in the consciousness that's saying, no, 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 you don't deserve to have this thing that your conscious mind is trying to manifest. And that will be acting as a block. So the more we begin to work with these laws, the more complicated it becomes. And the simplistic ideas that might first draw us to them don't always pan out. And that's the source of what many people experience, and certainly I've had my share of this over the course of my lifetime, as a profound disappointment. In fact, I noodle around the idea of my next book being called Spiritual Disappointment, to talk about exactly those ways that we think we can just sort of get a cookbook and an idea of how these laws work, and then we get very upset when it doesn't turn out that way.
Right. That reminds me of an idea I talked about with a guest of mine in a previous week about this idea of looking at life through kind of that Disney lens, where we have these certain expectations that everything is supposed to be very fairy tale-ish, and justice is always served in the end, and there's always a happy ending. And what have you found how that kind of jades us in a way and sets us up for this spiritual disappointment as you talk about?
Well, Brent, I'm sorry to say in some ways that the major learning of my life has been that spiritual growth and bubbling over fun happiness don't always go hand in hand. And a lot of times when we first get involved with the spiritual path, there is that sense of, okay, this is the thing that will make my life good, easy, abundant, successful, whatever the hook is that might appeal to a given individual. But spirit is all about growth in consciousness. Spirit is all about increase in depth and breadth of our capacity to hold compassion, our capacity to embrace complexity and wisdom. And unfortunately, emotionally, the growing experiences that requires are not always fun. And that's where we often are tested most severely in our spiritual growth. I think that's why in the Christian traditions, there's that concept of the dark night of the soul. I'm not sure it happens just one time, and once you're through it, it's all over. Because the people that I know, and in my own life experience, it seems like there are periodic dark nights of the soul. And those are the places where a lot of the greatest growth is actually taking place.
I couldn't agree more. And I think it plays into this idea that you've discussed in your work of cycles, how everything moves in cycles. So if you're referring to a dark night of the soul, and we are playing out cycles of karmic patterns and things in our lives, it's bound to come back up another dark night of the soul as we experience similar cycles in just a different place in our life.
Yes, I would say that's exactly what happens. There's this spiral concept that we may feel that we're facing the same growth issue again and again and again, and it's tempting to think, I'm not making any progress. But if you look carefully, what you'll usually find is that you're facing the same issue, but in a broader context or a different context, a more demanding context. And in truth, there are some major life themes that many of us will meet periodically over the course of our lives. But if we meet those and if we grow through them, if you look very carefully, you'll notice that there's tremendous progress made in the way you're meeting those and the context that they're arising in.
Yes, absolutely. And Lynn, I want to talk, we were talking about the complexity of karma previously, and I want to kind of stay on this topic because I'm curious. I hear this idea sometimes of eating other people's karma or taking on other people's karma. What are your thoughts on that? Because sometimes we can have this idea of that we are only generating our own karma, but it seems on a much deeper level, a metaphysical level, we are so interconnected with those that are very near and dear to us that it seems sometimes that we do take on other people's karma. What are your thoughts on this and your personal experience?
Wow, Brent, you've just touched on one of the things that most fascinates me. And I would say there is the capacity for that to happen. I mean, after all, if we want to talk in terms of broader realities, we are all one. And the consciousness that I think of as Lynn and the consciousness that you think of as Brent is an expression of a universal consciousness that ultimately connects us all. So I think that's the starting place for there being any possibility of what you're calling eating somebody else's karma. I think it's the whole principle behind the Christian concept of the atonement. That it's not that an angry God had to punish somebody and so the perfect son said, oh, kill me instead. It's rather that a highly advanced soul can absorb and lift the consciousness of many others and thereby elevate everyone. At one-ment is a way of breaking down the word atonement. And so we actually find this concept in Buddhism as well, where there is that capacity to actually take on somebody else's pain and suffering. And there was a very interesting character who was part of the intimate circle around the writer C.S. Lewis, a Christian metaphysical writer from Oxford by the name of Charles Williams. And he made a whole thing of the philosophy of substitution, taking that New Testament line to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ, very literally, that we could actually take on other people's suffering. And Lewis autobiographically tells the story of when his wife was dying of bone cancer and he begged to take some of it on. He subsequently developed a debilitating case of osteoporosis, which in men is not all that common. I had an experience some time back when my mother was in tremendous pain after having had 2 knee replacements in one surgery and not being able to tolerate the painkillers that they were giving her. So she was stuck with the pain. And I prayed to take on some of that pain. And the interesting thing was that there was a day when my knees were getting all of these twinges of pain. And at the time, in my journaling dialogue, I said, this doesn't really seem even possible. And the answer that came back to me was that because I was young and fit and my knees were strong, I was able to absorb some of that with it being not nearly as painful for me as the knee pain that she was suffering was for her. That night when I talked to her on the phone, she told me the most remarkable thing, that she felt she had turned a corner, that her knees weren't hurting that badly that day. So my mom and I were very close, and I think a close, caring relationship is sometimes a prerequisite for that kind of taking on. And I think we have to be careful about doing it because we can unwittingly maybe open ourselves to things that with a lot of bravado we think we're strong enough for and we're not. So I would say the more we're able to take the things that we're dealing with in our own lives, regardless of what the struggle might be, whether it's overcoming a habit, for example. You can say, I'm trying to overcome this bad habit because my health would be better off if I did it. Or we can say, as I overcome, I want to do this on behalf of everyone struggling with this bad habit. Because as each one overcomes, the whole is lifted. It's really the same principle as somebody breaks a record for the fastest sprint, and then suddenly a bunch of people can break that record. As one person overcomes, it becomes that much easier for others. So if we are, for example, trying to cut back on participating in gossip or negative talk about other people, we can do it as a self-improvement project, and that's great. But we can also carry the sense that we're doing this as our contribution to leveraging the consciousness of the whole. And I believe that that is part of how we collectively can eat each other's karma, bear one another's burden, practice the law of substitution or atonement. The Buddhist practice, by the way, is Tonglen, that where you actually take on something on behalf of others.
Absolutely.
So it seems to run through all the
Wonderful.
wisdom traditions.
Yeah, of course. I think that's one thing that you've definitely showed very clearly in your work is that blending of East and West and how those similarities are
Yeah.
so prominent. And I think Casey really had that come up in his work, and that was something that he struggled with a bit because these were concepts that he wasn't familiar with growing up in a very traditional Christian background. So it's really nice to have, people like yourself who are helping to blend this together because that's what's going to carry us into the future, I feel.
Yeah, I agree. And, in Casey's time and place, it was absolutely an enormous thing that this Southern Christian man, Bible believing, Bible reading, Bible teaching, would bring out these very Eastern, at the time they were considered Eastern concepts, like, for example, reincarnation and karma, and even the idea of universal law that applies in a very metaphysical, spiritual way. That there was a tendency for traditional American religion to be kind of cut off from that. You believed the right things and you went to heaven. You didn't believe the right things, you went to hell. Casey was bringing in more of that, engaging with the higher law as the foundation of all spiritual work. In today's world, where we're exposed to the beliefs of cultures and religions all over the world in a way that previous generations weren't, it's much more natural to say, if a huge portion of the world's population believes this, there might be something to it. But in Casey's day, that bringing together of East and West was absolutely remarkable.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And you made a great point that I think the one of the hallmarks of our time now is that if you want to educate yourself on any world religion or any topic, whether it be metaphysical, spiritual, or something that's more grounded in the physical, it's available to you. And I think that's a powerful tool that's helping to really contribute to this cosmic evolution that you talk about in your book, Beyond Soul Growth.
Yeah, it's such a privilege to be alive at this particular time. It's very easy with events in the world and in our country going in ways that are very confusing and difficult for most people to think of this as a great time. And yet, when we look at the opportunities that we have, I remember the days that if you wanted to learn something, you had to find a good library and go get books or microfilm and make notes on paper, and it was an enormous project. Now the collective wisdom of the world is literally a keystroke away. And I don't think I can't even quantify what a blessing, what an opportunity it is to have been alive for that. It's enormous.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Mm-hmm.
Lynn, I want to talk a little bit about a couple other topics here. In thinking of this idea of reincarnation, I know we've talked about karma a lot, and I know you also discuss this idea of reincarnation so often in your work. For our viewers who may not be as familiar with this concept, how exactly is karma transmitted from one lifetime to another?
Well, of course, we're in the realm of speculation here. None of us really knows any of these things for certain. Well, I like to say that every one of us, no matter how much we think we understand it, will be surprised when we get to the other side. But based on the best information we do have from the wisdom traditions of the world, from those who've had experiences in other dimensional consciousness and so on, I think we would have to look to the levels of body other than this flesh body that we think of as being the defining selfhood. In truth, the flesh body is just the most three-dimensional, concrete body that we have. And we have a series of bodies that are of ever finer vibratory quality that actually kind of span the various dimensions. And who knows how many of those there are. But we have a flesh body, we have an astral body, we have a mental body, an emotional body, an energetic body, and so on. And it's in the patterning of energy that apparently our karma is carried over. And it's the patterning of energy that then, when it's drawn to a new flesh vehicle, makes a kind of hand and glove fit with the genetic material of that flesh vehicle, with the environmental influences, the family influences of that new flesh vehicle. That is the best readout of what is patterned into the energetic body. And then the presence of that energetic body within that flesh vehicle seems to kind of shape of the many ways. We know that of our genetic potentials, not all of them are turned on. And so what gets turned on, what gets expressed, what gets lived and experienced will be largely a playing out of the patterns of energy that go with us from lifetime to lifetime to lifetime. And of course, the least dense, the least formed patterns are consciousness itself. So if we think pure consciousness, patterned energy, patterned thought, patterned emotion, and so on, right on down into a flesh body, we can kind of see how in that consciousness and energetic body, we would have the patterning that then would remanifest as what we would call karma in a subsequent experience. You know, the late Lynn Cayce, Edgar Cayce's son, who was one of the leading lights I cut my teeth in the Edgar Cayce material on listening to, used to say, and he'd get a twinkle in his eye when he would talk about karma, he would say, karma is memory, and stop right there. And I've chewed on that a lot over the years. And I think that of all the definitions we might have, that one is the most useful, because it is truly that which we hold on to in deep, deep memory, beyond the brain, beyond the current nervous system, beyond the current flesh body, but in consciousness itself. Karma is what we remember.
I like that. Thank you for sharing that, Lynn. And so we've talked quite a bit about karma and reincarnation here. I want to tie in another concept that's very important in your work and comes through so much, this idea of grace, or kind of living in a state of grace. So I'm curious, Lynn, how does this idea tie into karma, and is grace sort of this random force that works through us, and is it also an immutable law we've talked about with karma, in which we can kind of learn to cooperate with every day?
You know, I think that here's another place where Edgar Cayce's contribution to our understanding is really important, because he is one of the few voices that gives the law of grace equal status with the law of karma. Now, grace, if karma is hard to pin down and define and describe, grace is even more so. Because sometimes, and I used to have the word grace in the title of when I would talk about or do a conference on this material, and I came to realize that for too many people, grace was tied to things they might have heard in a childhood religion. Grace was tied to the idea of it being rather random, lightning strike, benefit coming your way when you least expect it or least deserve it. As I've often characterized it, people thinking of grace as a get out of jail free card. And so I've learned to kind of back into the concept along the lines of universal law so that it's, I think, a little bit more comprehensible. Grace has to do ultimately with the idea that karma has never been about crime and punishment. Karma is about growth, expansion of consciousness, learning, living into our divine nature. As long as we think of karma as being about crime and punishment, grace is like this thing that's unfair. Well, why should he get away with that and not have to pay his karmic debt? Why should I escape the karmic debt that's hanging over me for something I did in 1975? That kind of thinking. Grace, if we look at it as nothing more or less than the ever-present opportunity to align our consciousness with divine consciousness, is what completely alters how our karmic destiny might play out. For example, I may be, to just use a really small example, I may be building a certain kind of karma by being in a very dark mood. I may be in the grocery store. I may be very critical of the person ahead of me in line in the express lane with an overflowing basket. I might be thinking dark thoughts. I might be judging that person. I might be creating in a little mini framework a piece of necessary corrective karma. I might be creating the necessity that someday I'm just oblivious and maybe in a great mood, and without realizing it, I unload a whole load of groceries in the express lane and then see a line of glaring people behind me. That's a little silly vignette of meeting a karmic debt, so to speak. However, Grace would say that when I was first in line and I was first tempted to condemn that person holding me up in the express lane, when I was first tempted to think this is a selfish, inconsiderate person and my whole story of negativity about that person, grace is that opening, always there, even if we are keeping it blocked away, to remember the oneness, to say, I don't know what's going on in that person's life. I don't know what circumstances may have led to this person being ahead of me in the express lane. And instead of sending thoughts of condemnation, instead of sending negativity into the collective sphere, I send benevolent thoughts. I might send a prayer. I might engage in conversation with the person behind me who's also fuming at the person with the full basket in the express lane and help lift their consciousness. That's an example of dipping into remembering oneness that altered a karmic destiny. And I've deliberately used a pretty silly example because sometimes we can see these things more easily in common everyday experiences than in the broad canvas of people doing dastardly deeds to one another. So one of the places grace can intervene is when we allow our consciousness to open up to the oneness before we set a negative stream of cause and effect into play. There's another place where grace can come along and change everything. Maybe you've done something. Maybe you've done something that you feel guilty about. Maybe you've done something that you think, oh boy, this is going to have to catch up with me someday. This night, this life, or later, whatever this thing is I've done is going to come up on the docket and I'll have to pay the price. I call that karmic thinking, the it'll catch up with me someday syndrome. Remember, karma is not about crime and punishment. Karma is about growth, learning, expansion of consciousness. And sometimes with our guilt and with our expectations of having to pay a so-called karmic debt, we just ensure that that's exactly what will happen. What if instead, about this thing that we know we've done that is less than what reflects the highest spiritual ideals, we say, wow, I really regret having done that. I've learned something about what it feels like to have done that. And I'm going to make a point of making any restitution that I can make At the very least, if it's too late to make restitution directly, doing things that demonstrate that I am no longer of the consciousness that I was in when I committed whatever that error was. At that point, we have opened up to an influence that is always ready to have us operate from the best and the highest. Again, the oneness that is an ever-present reality within us. Just as karma can't be turned on or off, our oneness with the divine, with divine law, with divine love, with divine direction, can't be completely obliterated. It can only be obscured. So in those moments that we allow ourselves to take full responsibility for what we may have done that violates the highest principles of spiritual law, take responsibility, genuinely repent in the sense of not just shedding crocodile tears and doing a lot of mea culpas, but owning up to the depths of whatever we may have done, and then being of a consciousness of oneness that is no longer the consciousness that did the original thing. We have allowed the law of grace to transform everything. The Cayce readings, for example, are full of examples of people who are paying a so-called karmic debt in rather fulfilling ways, caring for someone who they might have harmed in the past in a fulfilling, loving relationship. Now, that's not the same thing as having someone come along and do to you the harm that you did to another. You may, the person who was going around causing people to be deformed in another life might be a gifted plastic surgeon in this life. And that would be an indication of the influence of grace. This is a soul that woke up. Grace has a lot to do with waking up to the oneness, allowing our consciousness to be transformed. And one of the things people sometimes lose sight of is that dipping into the consciousness, and I do mean dipping in because few, if any of us, can stay there in some kind of a sustained, beatific state. But if we have a meditation practice where we dip into the affirmation of those higher things, if we, as we go about our daily life, periodically remember our ideals and consciously open to that flow, our consciousness is altered. And remembering that karma is about learning and growth, if the consciousness has already been transformed, then corrective karma isn't necessary. Instead, there will be opportunities to demonstrate a transformed consciousness, and that makes all the difference in the world. And sometimes even after we have been meeting the manifestations of so-called bad karma, we're having difficult situations that seem to be payback from something we've done in the past, the law of grace has the potential for us of transforming the way we meet that karma. There's a beautiful Cayce reading that talks about either tapping into the law of, and this was somebody who had a pretty debilitating physical ailment. He was told it was karmic in nature, but that he still had a choice whether to meet that in joy and tranquility or to insist on meeting everything the hard way. So to the degree that we accept our challenges and accept that they are for our growth, for our overcoming, for our expansion, and that as we meet them with an expanded consciousness, we can leverage the human race, we start meeting our karma under the influence of grace. So that's kind of a broad picture of how the two laws are constant, immutable, ever-present, but their interaction with one another has a tremendous impact on how we experience our karmic consequences, so to speak. And I should also add this. It can almost sound like grace is being a good person and doing the right thing, and karma is just waiting for the school of hard knocks to change us. The big thing about grace is that there's a concept here, too, of leverage. The consciousness of the divine, the consciousness of the oneness, the consciousness that is grace has motivating power. It has a way of shifting us that all the hard work in the world will never do. I sometimes use the analogy of getting on the moving sidewalk at the airport. You know, you've got all your luggage and you're trying to get to your connection. And you can either carry it step by step, and that would be like doing it all by your own effort, or you can step on the moving sidewalk. And as anybody who has walked on a moving sidewalk knows, your steps are greatly accelerated because the sidewalk is carrying you along and you can just fly along. Grace is like a stream of the consciousness of oneness that when we step into it, it changes everything. And we might not realize at the time that 5 minutes of touching something in a meditation where we just let go, it doesn't seem like much has happened. There might not have been bright white lights. There might have been non-dual consciousness. There might not have been beatific bliss. And yet, something about the day flows better because we touched into that for 5 minutes in our meditation. That's another example of stepping into the influence of the law of grace, at least as I understand it.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that, Lynn. You touch on so much in that short time, and gave some great analogies too. I really, really like that.
Now they won't have to take the course.
Yeah, exactly. Well, as our viewers can certainly see, there is a lot to be learned from a teacher like yourself.
Well, I enjoy interacting with people because I always learn so much from the people who are part of these courses. And of course, what we do is take these things that I'm presenting as concepts, and there are actual guided sessions that people do, applying it to situations in their own life. And that's really where the rubber meets the road. Because, you know, we can all read books or watch videos and get ideas about how things might work, but it's day-by-day application that really, really matters.
So true. So true. And Lynn, I want to ask a question that's very relevant for what's going on a global scale really right now. This idea of tragedies. And my brother and I were discussing this idea just last night, and we were talking about, we kind of came to this idea that is there really such a thing as tragedies as we understand it today, or are we simply experiencing intensified karma both on an individual and group level? So I guess in saying this, is there really such a thing as bad karma, and is this experience of tragedy really a tragedy, or are we just experiencing karma as it bubbles up on larger scales?
Well, Brent, that's not only an important question, I think it's also a sticky wicket. And the reason I say that is because if we want to come from the broad philosophical position of reincarnation and karma, if we look at the continuity of life and the idea that there are no accidents and that nothing can happen to us that in some way doesn't fit in with the soul's agenda for growth, for learning, for expansion, for discovering what we did in the past might not have been so great, whatever it may be, that is all true. And from that perspective, we can say all is well. There is no such thing as true tragedy. However, it gets really, really difficult when we start kind of looking across the room or looking across the globe and applying it to other people who are suffering. If, and this is a big if it makes us complacent, if it robs us of our compassion, that's one of the ways that thinking about reincarnation can almost insulate us from the connection, the growth in our capacity for care and compassion for others can get stunted rather than helped. So that if I look at somebody who has some handicap and my first thought is, well, that must be her karma, I better be careful, because what I'm building is an egoic sense of superiority. Sometimes, it's like if somebody who is our age or younger dies and we want to know what they died of, and it turns out they had some habit that we don't have. It's, okay, I won't die young. I don't do that. We're always comparing ourselves. And we have to be very careful about an unconscious tendency to compare ourselves to reassure ourselves that we're okay, unlike those other people who are meeting their karma. We didn't do that. We're okay. Again, falling back on some of the examples in the Cayce readings, there were many times when people were told that someone, for example, children with Down syndrome were identified as coming in with that physical and mental limitation, in order to teach those around them love. And of course, anyone who has interacted with a person with Down syndrome knows what a very, very special opportunity to experience love that is. So there we have a case where a soul with a limitation was actually took that limitation on as a living sacrifice, an act of service for someone else. We never know why another person is under adverse circumstances. So as long as the big picture that says there is no true tragedy does not cut us off from our compassion, as long as it doesn't cause us to say, well, they're getting what they deserve and turn our backs, then I think it's okay to take that big picture to make some sense out of the insanity that we see going on all around us. But never let it rob us of our humility and our compassion. Otherwise, we are just spiraling downward in a way that you look at what the caste system does. That's a good example. And Cayce pointed to this, by the way, in talking about where, despite knowing about reincarnation, India had not made the best of that opportunity. In a system like the caste system, the people in the lower caste make little effort to elevate themselves. The people in the higher caste feel little or no responsibility to help the lower caste. Everybody accepts you're born that way because it's your karma, and nothing moves forward that in a way that could happen if the people in the lower caste understood that they were free to do whatever their capacities allowed, and if the people in the upper caste had more compassion. So we have to be super, super careful. End of
Absolutely.
sermon.
That's good. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, of
No,
course.
it's an important question. We all find
It really
ourselves
is.
slipping
Yeah.
into it. The
And I think,
downside of it. Okay, that can't
yeah,
happen to me because I don't do those bad things.
right, right. And I think you've raised just such an incredible point, is that compassion, having compassion and still being there to support those who are a victim of tragedy is such an important practice in our lives. But
Right.
also, keeping that higher perspective will allow you not to kind of, like you said, spiral down into um, this idea that the world is kind of going to crap, I guess, for lack of a better
Right.
term,
Right.
because there are
And
so many
yeah.
incredible things that are going on behind the scenes that you don't necessarily get to see from I guess you would say some mainstream sources of information and knowledge tend to present a more pessimistic view of the world, when in fact there's so many incredible things and great teachers and people who are doing incredible work and being of service to humanity in general.
And Brent, here I also have to go back to the evolutionary view as an important part of the puzzle. Because if we look at the pattern of evolution, cosmic evolution, biological evolution, chaos and destruction, whether we like it or not, is a precedent to evolutionary breakthrough. things have to get really crazy in order for creative emergence to come along and bring in something new. So even, right now, many people feel that we're at a time where there are no good choices here in America come November. And that's a very uncomfortable feeling. But maybe it takes enough people feeling there are no good choices for a whole new way of looking at things to begin to emerge. It's like the old thing of the forest fire clears the forest for new growth to come, the cycles of things. Evolution is messy, very, very messy. And few of us change unless or until we become so uncomfortable with things as they are that the pain of changing becomes less than the pain of staying the same.
Wow, well put. And I think you raised another great point, just to stay on this topic real quick, about you talked about how people are a little worried about the choices they'll have come November. And I think exactly what you said is that it's an opportunity for us to evaluate our own beliefs and evaluate our
Yes.
own choices that we're making every day. And that's the true beauty of what's coming out of this situation, is that we're presented with very different options, and it allows us to really self-reflect and think, how am I playing out all these things that I see and maybe disagree with? How is that playing out in my own personal life, and how can I better myself through that understanding?
There, you've just said it, Brent, because in a sense, as long as we keep reshuffling the same party line positions about domestic and world problems, we will continue getting endless iterations of what we have already had. It's only when consciousness changes that something new and better can emerge. I used to be just a really committed free market capitalist. Communism, socialism, bad. Free market capitalism, if it were just allowed to be, would solve everything. Well, I don't believe that anymore, because I'm seeing that in the hands of greedy and corrupt people, bad things happen if there is no control. Same as happens, idealistically, socialism would be great, except people can be greedy and corrupt, and it doesn't work out so well because some people end up exploiting others just as they would in a capitalistic system. So looking at the idea that as long as human beings are not more conscious, more compassionate, more just, any system is subject to all kinds of corruption and abuse and disenfranchisement, whatever it may be that goes wrong. So for those who put their effort into the thing you talked about, or as Voltaire said, tending their own gardens, that's not just narcissistic navel-gazing. It can be done with a consciousness that says, okay, what I do in the voting booth might be choosing the lesser of two evils from whatever your perspective might be, but what I'm doing in my daily practice and how I treat my neighbors and how I train my consciousness toward higher things may be the one hope that humanity has right now. It's not a small thing. It's right now the leading edge that holds the possibility, and in my opinion, the only possibility for a true change for the better.
Yes, couldn't agree more. Very empowering message too. Now, Lynn, while we still have a few minutes here left in the show, I wanted to, pretty much everything we've talked about today is really inclusive in your online mentoring program, and of course your book as well, Beyond Soul Growth. So I want to quickly touch on, you'll be speaking in Virginia Beach during the New Year's conference this year, which is really themed around the law of attraction. So I'm curious, Lynn, could you give us a glimpse into what conference attendees could expect from your presentation?
Yes, I'm actually speaking the whole morning of New Year's Eve day. So the focus is going to be very much in line with a lot of the things we've been talking about here, actually. Stepping into a co-creative role. New Year's is typically a time when people are setting their intention for the next year in terms of personal desires, what sorts of things you might want to work on, change, manifest in the coming year. And in my session, we're going to focus particularly about the approach that is co-creative, that says, my partner in this is nothing less than the same divine force that brought a universe into manifestation. And going into the new year with a vision and a plan for being a co-creator. There's also every New Year's Eve, in fact, my first visit to Virginia Beach was for the New Year's conference in 1970. And there's a New Year's Eve party, but then partying quiets down at 11:30, and everyone gathers for a meditation to see the new year in meditation. And I'm going to be leading that this year. When Allison asked me to do it, I laughed and I said, I haven't stayed awake till midnight for New Year's for a number of years now, but I suppose it will be good for me to have a reason I have to. So I'll be doing the New Year's meditation this year, which I consider to be a great honor.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, what better reason to stay up for
Right.
midnight than to usher in the new year in a wonderful state of meditation, open-heartedness.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
And Lynn, as a final question, are there any upcoming conferences or projects that you'll be involved in that you maybe have in the works that you could tell us about?
Well, I am going to be the speaker at the Mo Ranch Retreat. That's in Central Texas in the Hill Country, kind of partway between San Antonio and Austin. And it begins on Thursday, October 7th and runs through that weekend. And it will be on the evolutionary co-creator material from my book. And I'm currently deeply involved with a partner, Eileen Malo, on a program under ARE auspices called Journey to Wholeness and Integrative Growth. And we're right now at the start of module 8 out of 12 in that program. And it's going so well. We have a handful of people we work with very personally, very intensely on their growth and their contribution to the collective growth. And it's been quite an experiment in a new way of working with people with a combination of telephone connection, online connection, and a couple of live retreats. They've been to Virginia Beach one time in April. They're coming back in November. So we're working with our inaugural run of that and looking at ways to expand that program and make it available to more and more people. And that's still very much in the conversation stage where we go from here. But it takes up a pretty good chunk of my time, as you can imagine.
Absolutely. Well, Lynn, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing all that, and thank you so much for coming on the show. We'll make sure that we give our viewers all the links that they need to register
Terrific.
for all the events that we've talked about today. And of course, if they'd like to purchase your book as well. So I thank you so much for doing what you do, Lynn. You're doing incredible work, and it's truly inspiring to somebody like myself. And I hope it inspires our viewers to really self-reflect and think about what type of energy and what type of thoughts and action they're bringing out into the world personally.
Thank you, Brent. I always enjoy our conversations.
Likewise. Take care, Lynn. Thank you so much. Don't miss your chance to spend time with Lynn in person. As I mentioned before, she is a featured presenter at the annual New Year's conference centered around the law of attraction this year in Virginia Beach at the ARE, and that takes place from December 29th through the 31st. If you can't make it to the ARE in Virginia Beach this year, I encourage our viewers to sign up for Lynn's online learning course, and this is titled Reincarnation, Karma, and Destiny, Working with Universal Law to Change Your Life. This takes place from September 7th to October 4th of 2016, and registration is going on now, and you can do it at edgarcayce.org. If you'd like to purchase Lynn's latest book, Beyond Soul Growth, you can visit our website as well at edgarcayce.org/catalog. On behalf of everyone at the Association for Research and Enlightenment and our partner at The More Show, I wish everyone a beautiful, love-filled week. Thank you so much for tuning into our program, and remember to always be mindful of the karma that you are creating every single day. I'll see y'all next week. Until then, much love. And it's time for the thought for the day today here on Reflections, the wisdom of Edgar Cayce. And joining me to discuss the thought for the day today that we have chosen from the Cayce readings is Dr. Bill Austin. Bill, thanks so much for coming on.
Good morning, Brett. Always a pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking me. I appreciate it.
Of course, my pleasure. And if you can go ahead and read the excerpt from the Cayce readings that we chose to discuss as the thought for the day today.
I'd be happy to. This thought comes from reading 2030-1. Know that it is not all just to live, not all just to be good, but good for something, that you may fulfill that purpose for which you have entered this experience. Just a few short words, but boy, what a lot is in here. In the beginning we said not just good, but good for something. Good for something. Whose standard are we going to live by? Is that a standard somebody else develops for us? A standard that society builds for us or a community builds for us? Or is something that we have to actively decide for ourselves? I think the Cayce readings continuously talk about your foundation really is your ideal, so that you're moving towards something. He gets into that at the end where he says, fulfill that purpose for which you entered into this experience. And what is that purpose that we're trying to fulfill? Well, I think it is reuniting with our Creator, the creative force that we're a part of. And that a part of, not apart from, but a part of that creative force. We're a part of that spirit, of that life. And our purpose, I think, needs to be how can we be good to each other? How can we be good to others based on this principle of becoming aware of who we are, and what we're here for. And the Cayce readings constantly said, we grow to this consciousness of our oneness with God. And we do that by our physical actions towards each other. And I'll come back to a principle you talked about a lot. I am my brother's keeper. We are each other's keeper. We grow in that experience, in that consciousness, by how we work with each other. So, I think there's a difference in the goodness that he's talking about here. One might be just on a physical plane, and that's good. I'm not saying, we're not kind to each other, but the essence of why we want to be kind to each other is so that we can fulfill our function and help the person that we're being kind to fulfill theirs.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Bill. I love that. And it is what you said is a reminder that we're not in this alone, and it is so important. When it's okay to just be good. That's wonderful, but you have to be good for something, and that reminds me of the Cayce ideals. Is that where are you coming from? What's your purpose in doing that? Is your purpose to find the reason why you're here and help to facilitate that for other people? Because I think that's really what Cayce is touching on here. One of the other things I really like about this is it's kind of like a call to action from Cayce. He said, don't just live very consciously, question what your motives are and what your purpose is here. And in doing that, you'll really, find the reason why you are here. And so, like I said, it is really a call to action, but And of course, it is the right path to be good, as you said, to all those who walk into your life. But it is most important, especially at this time, such kind of a pivotal time in human history, as Casey talked about, to stand up for what is good, to be active, to participate in what you really think is good, and get out there and apply it. And remember that it's all about what's good for all. If it's something that's good that only benefits you and it's to the detriment of other people, Casey was very clear that's not good. It has to
Right.
be in consideration of all, because you got to remember that interconnection that we have. So I encourage, I guess, in this, to me, this is an encouragement for myself, and I encourage others to stand up for a cause that is working hard to, as Casey said, make the world a better place for everyone. Seeking to support those who are doing what is right, and in doing this, you will get that beautiful feedback where you start to discover, it starts to bubble up your true purpose, and you break through those kind of elusive feelings that are constantly plaguing us, that we're separate and we need to divide.
Yes.
And there's always these external factors that are trying to kind of push that upon us, but it's so important to connect with what's good and connect with other people who are also working on that. And in doing that, as I said, you'll really learn to channel ways to go about best accomplishing what your soul's purpose is here in this incarnation. The answers and the next steps will kind of fall into place if you have that, like I said, the ideals that are in the right place.
Yes, and I think you bring out the core concept there, and it's conscious thinking, conscious living.
Yes.
And the fundamentals in the Cayce readings give us the tools of how to do that. But I think the concept that you just talked about, conscious living, conscious thinking, that we really have to apply that. And as we do, it starts to spread and grow. And I think it is spreading. I think it is growing.
I think so too. Absolutely. All of our efforts create a ripple effect that, as long as we're in the right place and our heart's in the right place and we're in consideration of everyone else around us, you can really, really accomplish some good things, especially right now. I think we have more power and more resources, more tools to accomplish what we're trying to do and reach out to more people.
Yes, I agree.
Wonderful. Well, Bill, thank you so much for joining me for the thought for the day today here on Reflections. It is always a pleasure to have you on. So thank you so much for giving us some time today.
Oh, thank you, Brent. Thank you for asking me. I really enjoy it. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too, Bill.